Hi everyone, and welcome to the first Kings Park seminar for this spring. My name is Bronwyn Eyre and I'm going to be presenting today. I just want to start off by acknowledging that this webinar has been presented on and my research itself was done on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I want to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Today I'm going to be speaking about something I did through an API internship here at Kings Park with the Friends of Kings Park Fund, which was all about trying to understand the impact of introduced honeybees on native plants. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about honeybees in general, then about my PhD research and how that got me interested in honeybees, and then finish up with that literature review I completed during my API internship. If you have any questions at all today, you should see an option to click on a little button that has little question marks on it. That's the Q&A, and you can type out your question, and at the end of today I'll go through those and answer them. Or I'll answer any questions that haven't been covered in my talk as well, but feel free to type questions in there while I'm speaking. As I said, my research was all about the impact of introduced European honeybees on native plants. Worldwide, we know that there are about 20,000 species of bees and at least 1,500 here in Australia. Despite this, I'd bet you dollars to donuts that if I went out into the street and asked someone to describe a bee, they'd describe something that was yellow and black, that was striped, that lived in a hive and that produced honey. This guy. Scientific name is Apis mellifera, but it's also more commonly known as the Western honeybee or the European honeybee. As that name suggests, you'll find this bee naturally in Africa, in Europe and the Middle East, but since the 1600s they've been spread right across the world, and these days you'll essentially find them anywhere that isn't under permafrost. They were spread for their role in crop pollination and honey production, and these days you'll find them in managed hives, both on a small scale with backyard beekeepers who'll have 1 or 2 hives, but also on large commercial scales as well. This is an almond orchard, and without honeybees we don't actually get any almonds, and you can have up to 100, 200 hives located in these sites. They've also gone feral throughout their introduced range, so you'll find them in places like tree hollows and even artificial nesting boxes as well. And you'll also find them in urban areas too. So everybody probably knows someone who's had bees in their house or in their wall or in their shed. Here in Australia, they were introduced in 1822 for their role in honey production and crop pollination. These days, honey and other hive products generate around $70 to $90 million a year in Australia, and we know that insects pollinate around 20 to 30% of our crops by volume, and honeybees play a significant role in that pollination. In Western Australia alone, there's formal record of honeybees visiting at least 130 native plant species, but it's likely that they visit a lot more. That map on the left-hand side of your screen is from the Atlas of Living Australia, and it shows everywhere where somebody has logged online and said that they've seen a honeybee. You'll see that they're predominantly along the coast, and they're predominantly in areas with high levels of native vegetation, because access to native flora is the essence of the Australian beekeeping industry. For example, if we look at this map on the left-hand side of your screen, this is all of the apiary sites you'll find in Western Australia. So these are areas where aparists, so commercial beekeepers, have a license to hold their hives. If we zoom in a little closer to the state forest down south, which is where I grew up, and we overlay that map, you'll see that most of those hives fall within that state forest area. On this map, the green dots are showing current apiary sites, while the other colours are showing sites that are under application, pending or suspended. But it's important to realise that just because there's a green dot on this map, it doesn't mean that there are actually hives present in that location. It just means that an apiarist has permission to put hives in that location. When I first started looking at honeybees, I wanted to try and figure out how many honeybees there were in WA. So I knew that there were 4,572 hive sites in Western Australia, but I also knew that those hive sites weren't all filled. So a little bit of digging and found a report from 2007 that listed 39,000 registered hives in Western Australia. I also know that feral bees can be present in WA from densities anywhere between basically 0 to 77 hives per kilometre squared in our natural areas, and that each hive will contain between 20,000 to 50,000 worker bees. So if we do some rough back of the envelope calculations, we'll see that there's at least 1 billion bees in Western Australia, and there might be 2 or 3 billion bees flying around. There's a lot of interest in the effect that this introduced agricultural species has on native animals. If you talk to people who love birds, they might mention the fact that honeybees will sometimes take over the nesting hollows used by cockatoos. This is likely to only have a really strong negative effect if there's a limited number of nesting hollows available. If there's plenty of nesting hollows, then it won't have a huge effect on these birds. They also might be having an effect on our native insects, particularly if there's a large number of hives present in a site. They might outcompete the native insects for nectar and pollen. But again, this is all got to do with how many bees are present, how much nectar and pollen is being produced, and how much is required by the native pollinators in that area. What I've always been really interested in is the effect that these bees are having on plants. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a bright yellow plant. This is actually a weed species here in Australia, and there's been some really neat studies that show that if we didn't have honeybees, this weed, which is called the Scotch's broom, wouldn't produce any seed. So essentially, without this bees, there wouldn't be this weed. But we also know that there are some plants that actually seem to benefit from the presence of honeybees. So for example, some eucalypts will actually increase the amount of seeds they're producing when honeybees are around. And there are even some species that grow in urban remnants here in Perth that don't have any native pollinators left in those urban remnants. There's only honeybees, and if we took those honeybees away, those urban species won't produce any seeds. But there are also clear examples of when honeybees aren't doing a great job at pollinating and might actually be having negative impacts on our native plants. So the white flower you see in the middle of your screen is a Conospernum, and the honeybee is actually too large to pollinate this plant. So it goes in, it drinks nectar from the flower, but doesn't actually help it produce any fruits or seeds. I got interested in this space during my PhD. When I started it, it was all going to be about the bird pollination of our state floral emblem, the red ingrain kangaroo paw. This flower is the perfect example of a plant adapted for bird pollination. The honeybee drinks nectar from the base of the flower here. Pollen gets rubbed off on his back here by these bright yellow anthers. And when he first visited the flower, the hope is he brushed some pollen he was already carrying onto the stigma that sticks out down here. And while birds were the original focus of my PhD, I quickly discovered that there was an insect species that visited these flowers more than birds did, which, as you might be able to guess, was Apis mellifera, the European honeybee. This was the only insect pollinator I was seeing visiting these flowers, so no native insects were visiting kangaroo paws in my study sites. And I would see these honeybees visit flowers sort of 10, 20 times in a morning. But just because they were visiting the flower didn't actually mean they were contributing to their fruit and seed production. In order for that to happen, a honeybee actually has to contact the stigma, which on a kangaroo paw is this little bit that sticks out the front here. The pollen that the honeybee drops off then germinates down into the ovaries and seeds are produced. So one of the questions I was curious about when I was doing my PhD was how often a honeybee actually touched that important female reproductive part and how often they were just stealing nectar or pollen. So I went and I videotaped a bunch of bee visits. So you can see here this little honeybee, she's going down into the base of the flower to get nectar. And that is so far apart from this important female reproductive area that there's no way that she's pollinating the plant. Even when gathering pollen, sometimes the honeybees will miss that stigma as well. So this little honeybee is stripping pollen off of the anthers, but didn't actually ever make contact with the stigma at the very bottom of the flower there as well. I also compared this to birds to see how effective birds were at pollinating kangaroo paws. So this is a series of images from a camera trap where anytime a bird landed on a flower, the camera trap would take 10 images in a row. And you can see this little honey eater, as it goes in to get nectar from the base of the flower, sort of pollen is getting dumped off at its back. Depending on the size of your screen, you might also see that there's a little friend to this honey eater on the cage in the background as well, which I think is quite nice. Not all birds, however, were as good as that brown honey eater. This is a silvereye, and you'll see that he goes in, he grabs a flower, he pulls it down, and then creates a slit in its base to get to the nectar. So these silvereyes aren't pollinating. Interestingly enough, sometimes honeybees will actually use the slits created by the silvereyes to get to nectar as well, which is quite an interesting interaction. We pull all that data together and we just focus on the stigma. I found that European honeybees were only contacting that stigma, that all-important part of the flower, around 15% of the time. So 85% of the time they were acting as thieves, primarily stealing pollen, but occasionally nectar as well, compared to birds, which would contact that stigma around 45% of the time. But this wasn't where my curiosity ended, because I knew that these honeybees were visiting these flowers an awful lot. So my thought was, well, yeah, sure, maybe only 15% of the time they contact the stigma. But if they're visiting that flower 10 times, does that really matter? So I did another experiment that's really common in pollination studies, something called an exclusion experiment, where we manipulate the access to the flowers by using either wire or netting that has different size holes in it. So we'll have some that have a 1 millimeter netting around it, that block all potential pollinators. We'll have others where we do a 1 centimeter gap, which allows bees access to the flowers but keeps out vertebrates. And then we'll leave others that are open, which allow both bird and insect pollination. What I was really lucky was that with the kangaroo paw, because they were only getting visited by honeybees, my bird exclusion, that insect pollination treatment in the middle, actually was just honeybee only. So I got data on what role honeybees specifically were playing in the pollination of kangaroo paws. This first graph just simply shows the number of flowers that ended up developing fruits. We've got 1 or 100% at the top and 0 at the bottom. And you can see pretty clearly that the open flowers, which are in blue, have a much higher number of flowers developing fruits than any other treatment. So some plants had 100% of flowers producing fruit, but the average was around 70%, compared to my bird excluded plants, where the average of flowers that turned into fruits was only around 20%. So honeybees were doing a much worse job at actually turning flowers into fruits. And if we look at how many seeds those fruits were producing, the story is really similar. So our open flowers were producing around 50 seeds per fruit on average, compared to our bird exclusion, which was sitting at around 20 seeds per fruit on average. And you can also see from this box plot that the maximum was much higher when birds were able to visit these plants. Interestingly, when I pollinate these plants, so instead of letting birds or bees do it when I go out and do hand pollination, I was getting an average seed set of around 100 seeds per fruit, which is a lot higher than the seed set we're seeing in our open plants. It's almost double. This could be because honeybees are visiting these flowers as well as birds, and that might be lowering the seed set, but it could be a host of other factors as well, because as you saw from those camera trap footage, not every bird that visits a plant actually pollinates kangaroo paws as well. My background is in genetics, so I didn't want to leave the question there. I was also curious about the genetic impact honeybees had on the pollination of kangaroo paws. So I took a bunch of seeds, I grew them up, and then I got their DNA, and I did a series of analysis looking actually at the genetic diversity of the offspring produced from plants pollinated just by bees versus plants pollinated by bees and by birds. And what we see is if we look at heterozygosity, which is just a measure of how genetically diverse the offspring are, our open pollinated ones are much higher than our bee pollinated flowers. If we look at outcrossing rate, which is just a measure of how often does the pollen come from within the flower in the same plant versus a flower in a different plant, is much higher in our open flowers than our bee flowers. And likewise, if we look at the number of fathers per fruit, that's much higher in our bird and bee flowers than just the honeybee only flowers. This essentially meant that at the end of my PhD, I knew that honeybees were much less effective pollinators of kangaroo paws than our native birds are, when they produce 67% fewer fruits and 81% fewer seeds when honeybees were the only pollinator. Most of the time they were acting as thieves, and they were probably lowering genetic diversity and seed production in these populations. Honeybees don't just visit kangaroo paws. We've got formal records of them visiting 120 plants in WA alone, but I think that number's much higher. And they've also been introduced to hundreds of countries across the world. So I was really curious about the global impact these honeybees were having in their introduced range. To test this, I did something called a systematic review of the literature. It's where you go through systematically and try and find every document, every source you can on a topic. So I went to a couple of science databases, including Scopus and Web of Science, and I used a really broad search string to try and pull up any paper at all that mentioned honeybee pollination. This did mean that I got if you look at the bottom, I got a lot of papers that weren't related to what I was interested in, but it meant that I wasn't going to be missing anything either. I also went to library databases. So Trove is the National Library Database of Australia. So it links every single library in Australia, both university and public. But I also went to international library catalogues as well, including WorldCat, which covers a lot of English-speaking libraries across the world. I also went directly to industry and government websites and did Google searches just to make sure I covered absolutely everything. And what I found was 3,511 papers that looked at honeybee pollination in some extent. After reading through the titles and the summaries of all of those, I downloaded 139 that I thought would be relevant. And then after reading those papers in full, I came up with 67 plant species where the impact of honeybee pollination had been assessed. Then next was I took every bit of data I could possibly think of that could be useful out of those papers. So how the experiment was run, when it was run, and then I also took as much information as I could about the species as well. So how big were the flowers? How often did it flower? What color are the flowers? Does it grow as a tree or a shrub? Is it growing in Australia or is it growing overseas? And I created this giant database that I could then use to ask questions about the effects of honeybees on these plants. The first thing I noticed was that this is something that's being looked at more in Australia than anywhere else in the world. So this map is showing you the number of plant species each country has had the impact of honeybees assessed in. So in Australia, that's 33 species. The next highest is in South America, where Brazil has 7 species, and then North America, where there's been 7 species assessed in the US. This surprised me because honeybees have been getting spread around the world for a long time. The earliest introductions were in the 1620s in North America, and some of the later introductions are into Asia in about the 1960s. But Australia seems to be the focus of where these studies have occurred. The next thing that was really clear to me was that people were measuring a whole bunch of different things. A lot of studies looked at seed and fruit production, which seems sort of like the obvious measurements when you're trying to assess honeybee impacts, but others looked at outcrossing rates, like I did with kangaroo paws. Some looked solely at the number of flowers that were damaged by honeybees. Others looked just at pollen and nectar theft. Some looked at, they counted the number of pollen grains that were actually transferred to the stigma, that female part of the flower. Others looked at the patterns of honeybee foraging, so were they foraging more within the same plant compared to other plants? And then some went the extra step and looked at germination and seedling growth as well. They also measured these things in really different ways. So some did what are called single visit experiments, where you bag a flower before it's fully open. You wait for it to be ready. You then take that bag off, wait for a single bee to visit the flower, and then you put a bag back on and you see how many fruits and seeds are produced after one visit from one bee or one visit from one bird or any other pollinator as well. Others did what I did with kangaroo paws, so exclusion experiments, though this is primarily done when you're comparing bird-pollinated plants to insect-pollinated plants. Some did just observational studies, so they just looked at what the bee was doing. And then, in my opinion, the best ones actually went that extra step and they either experimentally added hives to a location or they experimentally removed hives from that location and saw what difference that made to our honeybee, to a plant's pollination. This meant that I couldn't do a formal meta-analysis because there's a huge amount of variation in what was measured and how it was measured. So instead, I took this data into a simple categorical approach. I classified the effects of honeybees as being positive when there was clearly a positive impact, so things like increased fruit and seed production, as potentially positive where there was things like an increased contact with the stigma or more pollen being deposited onto the plant, neutral when there was no significant difference when you had a honeybee there versus when you had a native pollinator there, negative when there's a clearly negative impact. So for example, reduced fruit or seed production, or really high amounts of flower damage causing bud abortion, or potentially negative when there's things like high levels of theft, reduced stigma contact, or reduced pollen deposition. And what I found was that there's about 27 plant species that are showing positive effects from having honeybees visiting them, 8 that are showing no significant effect from honeybees, and then 32 that are showing signs of negative effects. So this essentially breaks down to almost 50% positive and 50% negative, with 49% showing negative effects, 40 showing positive effects, and 12 showing no significant effect. This really surprised me that it was almost a clear 50-50, and it got me even more curious about what's driving the impact of these effects. One question I often get asked is, so you've got these positive and negative effects, but what about fruit set and seed set? So if you have a look at this graph, it's showing you on the left-hand side a number of species that are negatively affected. So this bright red is those that are clearly negatively affected, and the paler red is those that are showing potential signs of negative effects. And on the right-hand side, the dark blue is positive effects, the light blue is potential positive, and then this grey are no significant difference. So this bar at the top is just showing what I showed you before, which is the overall effect. But if we look at fruit set and seed set, fruit set is decreasing in about 9 species and seed set is decreasing in about 10 species. And then on the opposite hand, fruit set increases in 4 species and decreases in 11 species. And seed set increases in 11 species. The other common measurements were pollen deposition, which decreased in about 10 species, and then theft, which was occurring in about 13 plant species as well. But as I said, I'm interested in what drives these positive or negative effects, because honeybees themselves are really good pollinators. They pollinate a whole bunch of crop species across the world, and they do a great job at pollinating in their native range. And they've been beneficial to almost 50% of the plants in their introduced range as well. So I was really curious if I could figure out what made them have a negative effect on a plant. And I think it probably comes down to the structure of the flowers and of the plant itself. So I broke my data down a little bit more. So this is just simply showing life form. And like that previous class, we've got negative effects on the left-hand side and positive effects on the right-hand side. And you can see that there's no real clear trend in how the life form affects the impacts of honeybees, and that most of the species studied have been at shrubs themselves. Where it starts to get interesting is when we look at some features of the flowers themselves. So this is the primary flower colour, so the main colour of the flower. And you can see that a lot of the ones studied are white and yellow flowers, and that these white and yellow flowers tend to have a high number of species that have white and yellow flowers are showing positive or neutral effects from honeybee visitation, while those that have red, orange, or even pink flowers are more likely to show negative effects from honeybee visitation. And this really piqued my interest, because if you think about a quintessential vertebrate pollinated plant like a kangaroo paw, they tend to be more the red, orange, purple colours, while what we think of as a quintessentially bee-pollinated plant tends to be white and yellow flowers. So I thought, this is great. It's showing us that vertebrate pollinated plants are more likely to be negative affected than those that are normally insect pollinated. But if I broke the data down that way, that didn't fall out true. There's essentially a 50-50 split, with 50% of vertebrate pollinated plants showing positive effects and 50% showing negative effects. If we look at the shape of the flower, we'll see that most of the flowers studied are open flowers. So those are things like daisies or eucalypts, where they have that open flower shape. And then there's no clear trend again into whether or not these shapes are causing positive or negative effects after honeybee foraging. The next one that I think is really interesting is if we look at the size of the flower, because if we look down at the very bottom, we've got extra large flowers, and we work back up to the top to tiny flowers. And tiny and small flowers are more likely to show negative effects than our positive or potentially positive flowers. And at the very bottom, it's kind of switches over for the opposite, where those extra large flowers are actually more likely to show positive effects than negative effects. But again, this is only a database of 67 species, so it's really hard to draw strong conclusions about what's going on. We really need to get more information. The final bit of data I want to talk about is the magnitude of the effect of honeybees. And by this, I simply mean, okay, if I know in these plant species, seed set is decreasing, how much is it decreasing by? Are they only reducing by 5 seeds per fruit, or are they reducing by 100 seeds per fruit? So I looked at the top 3 measurements that occurred: fruit set, seed set, and outcrossing rate. and ask the question, okay, in fruit set, we know that 9 species are decreasing in their fruit set. And when they decrease by an average of 40%. So not only is fruit set decreasing, it's decreasing by quite a large amount. While in the 4 species where the number of fruits is increasing, the number of fruits only increases by about 20%. So this suggests that not only are more plants having their fruit set decrease, but the size of that effect is much larger. If we look at seed set, it's about 50-50. So when seed set decreases, it decreases by an average of 40%, and when it increases, it's increasing by an average of about 52%. And then outcrossing rate, when that is increasing in a plant species, it increases at around 10%, while when it decreases, it's decreasing at a rate of around 40%. So I think this is really interesting, but it's also based on a really small number of studies. So we need more data to sort of unpack this a little bit further. But in conclusion, I guess what do we know? We know that the direct impact of honeybees on small native plants has only been assessed on a really small number of species, that across the 67 native plant species studied, almost half were negatively impacted by introduced honeybee foraging, and that flower size and colour appear to be an important predictor, but that we need more studies. And that those studies should occur in a wider range of plant species, both threatened and common. We also need to look at the longer term impacts, because most of these are just looking at the most at fruit or seed production and maybe germination success, but obviously there's a lot more to do with the plant's life than just how much fruit and seed it produces. We also need to understand what features are driving these positive and negative impacts. So I really think the size and structure of flowers needs to be looked at further. And I think it's also important that we compare the difference between feral hives, which are present year round, and commercial hives that are present in a higher density, but are often moved between seasons to follow peak nectar production. Thanks so much for tuning in today, either live or watching this recording. We've got time for some questions. I know, so if you haven't yet asked a question, feel free to publish that in the Q&A. The first one that came through, which actually came through earlier this morning, was looking at the effect. Was a question about what percentage of plants pollinated by both honeybees and birds. And that, I think, is a really interesting question. It's not one that I've looked at directly, but I know that Ray Wills in the late 80s did his thesis looking at honeybees in Beekeepers Reserve north of Perth. And he actually found that 63% of vertebrate pollinated plants were getting visited by honeybees compared to about 20% of insect pollinated plants. So he's found that honeybees were preferentially visiting the vertebrate pollinated plants. And which is really interesting. His theory was that that was based on how much nectar and pollen they produced, because these vertebrate pollinated plants tended to have bigger flowers, so we're producing more nectar or pollen, and that might be attracting the honeybees. As to how successful they are at pollinating those plants, we don't know, but that's something really interesting to look at. There's a comment about honeybees and Conospermum from David, saying that in the case of the honeybee and Conospermum, the honeybee actually prevents the native insect pollinator from pollinating the plants, hence the pollen honeybee presents seed production. And that's a really cool example. I've actually got some Conospermum with me in the room, and you might be able to see, depending how good my camera is and your computer is, that the flowers on the Conospermum are really, really small. So when the honeybee goes in to drink nectar from them, they just stick their tongue in and get some nectar, but they don't actually pollinate the plant at all, which means that there's actually a reduced amount of seed production when the honeybees are visiting these plants. There's a question from Debbie about how many sort of commercial and feral honeybee hives are around in Perth. Most of the commercial beekeeping occurs outside of the Perth area, but there are people who have backyard beekeepers as well in the Perth region as well. I'm sure most people know somebody who has honeybees in their backyard. If nobody has any other questions right now, but thinks of something later on, please feel free to get in touch with me, send me an email. I'm happy to talk about this all day long if I can. And otherwise, I'll end off today by saying to please join us each Thursday in September, because we've got 3 more talks coming up. And next week, it's going to be a lovely lady called Vanessa Brown talking about seed spaghetti and the enhancements she's doing to help seeds grow in rehabilitation sites. But otherwise, I will say thanks for joining us, and I hope you found this interesting. Bye.